So I'm going to start by providing some context that many of you will be familiar with, but I think it's important that we contextualize and put the challenge of urban finance where it is on the African continent. Africa is the fastest urbanizing continent in the world. To date, we have never seen an urban transition so as fast as what Africa is going through. What this means in numbers, it means that a city like Lagos, which is already a megacity, will by 2035 grow to 35 times its population that it had when it was independent. Overall, it means that by 2050, the cumulative population living in African cities will be 1.5 billion people. And of those, and I think this is really important to mention, 830 million of those will be youth. That means by 2050, 1 in every 3 young people living in the world will be African, right? This is an incredible opportunity. And why is this an opportunity? Well, there's not many things economists agree on. But one thing they do agree on, generally, is that when we have seen urban transitions happen in history, they have generally led to economic growth. The most recent, most rapid urban trajectory that we've had has been China. And China lifted nearly 800 million people out of poverty in 1 generation, right? So, for those who like graphs, this is a graph that shows that. But for those who are sort of keenly looking at the graph, you can see, sadly, us African countries are clustered here, which means that we're urbanizing really quickly, but we're not seeing the same commensurate gains in GDP growth as has happened elsewhere. And part of the reason for that is that if you want to get urbanization right, you need to invest. You need to invest in your infrastructure and your services. A lot of people move into a small space, if there is no infrastructure to manage that space, results in congestion, it results in slum formation and everything else. I love this diagram because it shows a global road density network, right? So it's your average road length per land area, right? And we see here, Monaco is winning, probably because they have an F1 ring, right? So that takes up a lot of their city, right? But if you look at the global road density network for sub-Saharan Africa, we are here. We're this tiny slice, right? We don't even have enough roads on our continent to be able to manage what we need to do, right? So we know that our cities are growing. We know that our people are moving there. We know we need to make the investments because otherwise our urbanization is not going to result in the same benefits as it has before. And this infrastructure financing gap is substantial. So people have estimated this. There are various estimates going around the world. I particularly like this graph because it shows some of the larger infrastructure sectors, so transport, telecoms, water, energy. But for all the infrastructure sectors, you see that our investment needs here on the continent are the highest, right? So we have still relatively low GDP growth, but we actually need more money than everyone else because we need more investments to make. And one number that is in the report is that closing this infrastructure gap will require doubling what we're already investing to about 200 billion USD per year. This figure is already out of date. People have already said this figure is a lot higher than what we actually wrote when we wrote this report 2 years ago. Okay? And most of that investment will be required in cities because that's where Africa's population is moving to, right? So that's the context. And so then my question is, so where's the money going to come from, right? And I think this is the question anyone in here who is working in a city, this is the big question they face on the everyday, right? We know what the needs are. People are knocking at our door. We know we need to make these investments. Where is the money going to come from? So it's not going to come from cities themselves. Our cities are not raising enough own source revenue. This graph is showing you what subnational, it's across different income groups in the world. But most of our African countries will be in low income groups. On average, we have $12 of own source revenue per head in our cities or in our local government. What that means is that what we're raising in things like property tax and everything else is very small. Compare that to high-income countries that are nearly at 3,000 US dollars per head at a local level, right? Okay, we need to improve this, and I'll talk about ways to improving this. But given the urgency, 2035 is around the corner, 2050 is around the corner. This is not generally where we're going to make the biggest gains in these big $200 billion dollars per year more that we need in investment. Nor is there sufficient public coffers. So here is an estimate that people have calculated, and there are fancy models that go behind this. But what they took is all cities in Ethiopia and all cities in Kenya. And what they wanted to look at is all the investments they need to make between now and 2050. And they looked at making those investments climate proof and what that will cost. And essentially, what it will cost incrementally per year for Ethiopia, 97 billion. Incrementally per year for Kenya, 96 billion. This was what their budgets were in 2020. So again, the gap is huge. This is not going to come from National Treasury. National Treasury is already struggling, right? So this requiring 42 billion, and in Kenya's case, 27 billion extra US dollars per year in investment to meet the infrastructure gap. And the more we don't invest, the more that number grows, because retrofitting has been shown to be 3 times more expensive than doing things from the start, okay? So now I've told you where it's not going to come from. It's not going to come from the city. It's likely not going to come from the National Treasury. So the place where there is money is flowing around in capital markets, right? So this is, again, this is actually a McKinsey chart. This is like the size of global GDP. And then you have various different sizes of financial assets. So you can see that actually it's dwarfing what global GDP is. But unfortunately, the story is that's not coming to Africa either, right? So here we don't have Africa. We're probably in other developing countries kind of here, right? This is just a global bond market. So we're not borrowing. We're not getting this money, but there seems to be a lot of this money out there, okay? And borrowing is not a bad thing. So I wanted to say this from the outset, because I think given all the debt crisis that we currently have and all the media that's around there, borrowing has got a very bad name. But borrowing done well is really good. And my students will know this social contract picture. The social contract is the implicit contract between government and its people, that if you pay us taxes, we will give you services, we will invest in public infrastructure and services. And what borrowing does is allows us to borrow for the road today, but ensure taxes over a whole generation pay it back. Because that road is not just going to serve people today, that road is going to serve people over a many number of years. It's what we call intergenerational justice, right? So if you get that right, you can do it well. We are not currently getting it right. A lot of our countries are very close to debt distress. So this is the context that myself, my co-author Anton Cartwright from the University of Cape Town, Awen Garang, who's a South Sudanese PhD student at Imperial University in London, and Vera Songwe, the former executive director of UNECA. This was the context that we said, and so we were like, okay, well, the story can't end here, because that would be depressing, right? Then we're just going to have all these people moving to cities and no money. So where is the money going to come from? So we started by asking ourselves, okay, if there is money out there, why are cities not borrowing? Like, what's stopping them from doing so? If you actually look back at the history of a lot of European cities, particularly in the United States of America, and increasingly now in Asia, cities actually borrow to finance their capital investments. What's stopping us African cities from doing the same? So we looked at 2 sides. Demand side, are cities even demanding to borrow, right? Is there a demand for this money to be going there? And if they're demanding it, is there a supply that is available and going to them? And so I'm going to break each of these in turn. My current network is unstable. Okay, well, we'll be fine. We're going to go through each one of these in turn, and we're going to look at each of these factors, and we're going to break it down as to why the financing is not yet going to cities. So on the demand side factors, we have legal and institutional barriers. So I did this, I did this big job, and I went through institutional structures and legal laws of 41 countries that I could find them for, including a good Google Translate on some laws, because things like Arabic and Portuguese are not my languages. But we actually looked at the laws and we said, can they borrow legally? And of those 41 countries, 32 could possibly actually borrow, 9 can't borrow. There's like, the law says no subnational government can borrow. 32 do say they can borrow, but if you start looking at the subtext, they make it very, very difficult for cities to actually borrow. Okay, so of those 32, we said then, okay, how many have actually borrowed? So we have 16, so about half in those countries. We have had one city who has tried to borrow once. But of that 16, most of it's once, and then it never happened again, right? The only countries that really, where subnational governments are borrowing regularly are South Africa and Nigeria, okay? Otherwise, this is like once, maybe in a lifetime this has happened, but it hasn't happened. And then we also looked at in the law, if borrowing is allowed, does national government have to approve you to borrow? And for most of them, everywhere except for 4 countries, you have to get approval from National Treasury. Now, from an economic sense, from an economic context, this is good, right? Because the National Treasury doesn't want you to overborrow and cause macroeconomic stability in your countries. We've already had financial crises, for example, in Latin America, that have been caused by city governments borrowing too much. But a very big problem when it comes to our continent is politics. And we have a lot of cities that are opposition strongholds in countries that prefer not to have opposition. And so this is then becoming a way to control, right? So, okay, so we have the legal and institutional factors. So then we ask ourselves, okay, if you remove those legal and institutional factors, now we pretend that everyone could borrow, would cities borrow? And then we came to the thing about what's called creditworthiness. So creditworthiness is the financial health for a city. It's what an investor will look at to try and assess, will they repay if they borrow, okay? What's the likelihood they will repay? If they're scared, they will say that it's riskier for you to borrow, and then they'll put your interest rates up, and then it will become very expensive for you to borrow. So we looked at the creditworthiness, and we found that most cities are actually far from creditworthy. Their budgets are not there. If you can find their budgets, if you look at it, their accounting standards are not in place. They don't have proper expenditure management. And importantly, they don't have access to sufficient forms of revenue. And so even if we removed all the legal barriers, it is unlikely right now that we would see more cities borrowing, because investors would look at those finances and they would say, too risky for me. In fact, the investors will look at the finances, and we did look at a lot of the finances, and they'll say, where are the finances, right? Because you actually can't even find a lot of this information. So you see, Africa is again the lowest on tax revenue as a share of subnational government revenue, and tax revenue is what you tend to borrow against, right? So if you're not generating enough tax revenue, you can't really leverage it to borrow anymore. But there's so much potential. Kisumu County is the county I work in Kenya, right? Where they actually calculated what could they be collecting if they were doing everything that they're allowed to do by law. And the difference is 425%. So this is what they're actually collecting. This is what the potential they could collect, right? So we're missing out on a lot of what we could do. And a lot of that creditworthiness lies in our own power as cities to get right, because it's just about doing what we're supposed to be doing, but doing it better. The next thing we looked at is that for a lot of cities in Africa, these are some of the secondary cities in Uganda, you can't even talk about collecting own source revenues because it's so negligible. Actually, the biggest thing that they rely on is transfers from national government. So if you look, these are 7 of the secondary cities in Uganda. everyone except for Jinja, which is a bit of an industrial city, has more than 85% reliance on the national government for their revenue. And so what does that mean? Well, that's great if they could borrow against that, but national governments are often very slow in putting their transfers forward. It's unpredictable. So even though it's their most important revenue stream, it is not something they can borrow against because it's very unpredictable, and it's very volatile in terms of what they get. Then we said, okay, if you could remove all the legal challenges, if you could remove the creditworthiness challenges, then would they borrow? And then we came to another problem, which is many cities don't even know what they want the money for. They have no pipeline of projects. Kinshasa, capital of the Democratic Republic Congo, 17 million people, 1,400 kilometers squared, has no pipeline of projects. If you're an investor who is going there, you actually don't know what the city of Kinshasa wants to invest in, right? Oh, sorry, wrong way. And a big problem is actually many cities will have something like this, a vision, and a very bold vision, but actually translating that to something that investors can understand, which Kisumu does have, which is like a list of projects. This is what we want investment for. They don't have, right? But then in Kisumu, whilst they have the list of projects, whilst they know what they want to raise money for, we then looked at Kisumu's budgets. This is the expenditures in 2021 and 22. They're only, of the money they already have to spend on capital, they're only executing 30% of what, so they can't even spend the money they already have, right? So here we have a city who has money from the national government to implement projects, a capital budget, but it's only spending approximately 30% of that. And so its execution rate, so the rest of the 70% are then given back to central government because it hasn't spent it, right? So those are some of the demand side problems, right? So those are the things that the cities themselves are stopping the cities themselves asking for money. So then we're like, okay, if the cities could better ask for money, is the money out there for cities, right? So if we could solve all the legal challenges, the creditworthiness challenges, the pipeline challenges, then could we have city financing? So then we started to look at the supply side, okay? The first thing that drives the supply side, so cities need to borrow in local currency. That's because city revenue is generated in local currency. People are paying tax in their local currency. If a city borrowed in US dollars and was raising only taxes in Tanzanian shillings, that would be terrible for exchange rate fluctuations. A city is not like a national government that has any sort of hedging capacity against fluctuations on exchange rate. So where does a city need to borrow from? Well, it needs to borrow from the domestic market, right, where there is domestic currency. So we looked at the domestic markets. This is not a map I did, but we found this map. There are only 3 countries in Africa that have domestic capital markets that are capitalized over 100 billion USD. That's South Africa, Egypt, Nigeria. All of these countries, so the ones that are white, there's no data for, but all of the countries that are light, there's very little money in the local financial market for a city to actually go and borrow from, okay? So even if we could solve everything on the city side, now we have a problem that the markets themselves, the domestic financial markets, don't, in many cases, have the capacity to carry money. So then we were like, okay, well, if the domestic don't have it, maybe somewhere else outside have it. And now remember, we have to look for places that could lend in local currency, because that's what cities need. So that takes out places like the World Bank, et cetera, because they can only lend in hard currency. And so we looked at the African Development Bank. Now, the African Development Bank, in 2019, November 2019, issued the guidelines on subnational finance. This sounds great. This is like literally their guidelines to say we want to lend cities money or subnational governments money. This is the framework within which we're going to do it in. So we were like, great, let's look at this framework. Because if this framework is working, then the African Development Bank should be able to lend, because the African Development Bank does have local currency lending in some currencies. So this is just a selection of African countries, and it just shows you some of the constraints. So African Development Bank, like other development finance institutions, is a national government to national government transaction. So African Development Bank will talk to the Ministries of Finance, will not talk to the cities directly, because the Ministry of Finances are shareholders in the national. So this subnational guideline is written from the perspective of a national government and not a city government. So we looked at some of the criteria that the African Development Bank uses. So the first criteria it uses is that the cities in the country can only borrow at the same rate that the country, their national country or the regional member country can borrow in. So everything that's an A here gets concessional finance. Everything that's a B here gets blended finance. Everything that's a C, because it's a higher income country, doesn't get to borrow at concessional rates. But that means for a place like South Africa, maybe a Cape Town can do it, but South Africa has municipalities with poverty rates that are really, really high that cannot take on non-concessional financing. So the African Development Bank treats every city in the country the same as it would treat the national government. The second thing is, there are certain countries, and again, this is only a subset because I can't fit 54 countries on a slide, but there are certain countries where the African Development Bank doesn't even have local currency financing options, right? Because they don't lend in that money. So for those countries, cities can't borrow anyway, okay? And then the African Development Bank, again, like it treats all of the cities the same in terms of their countries, in terms of what they can borrow, they also treat them the same in terms of their credit rating. They do not do a separate credit rating for the city. This is actually where Cape Town, for example, would lose out, because Cape Town actually has a pretty strong credit rating, even though the National Treasury of South Africa doesn't have such a strong rating at the moment, right? So everything is treated from a city level as if it was a national government. So then, these are the only cities we could find in Africa that have ever undertaken a credit rating. And a credit rating is important because it provides the signal to investors, is this place investable or not? So we only have 6 countries, cities in 6 countries, that have even ever attempted to get a credit rating. And most of them, like Kampala, Dakar, Abidjan hasn't happened yet, but Kampala and Dakar have only ever had it once. All these Kenyan counties have only ever had it once, and this is only a shadow credit rating. So most investors don't even understand what our cities look like. On top of it, there is what's called an Africa premium credit ratings. And the Africa premium has been calculated that credit rating agencies, so the big 3 like Moody's, S&P, and Fitch, that they have an Africa bias. They see something that's African and then they add a premium on top because they believe everything African is risky. And so UNDP calculated that this Africa premium means that African countries have foregone $74.5 billion US dollars and paid a premium of 2.9% more. So if that's already at a national level, and we don't even have credit ratings for our cities, our premiums are going to be through the roof. So now I've given you all the bleak story, right? And so if we ended there, that would be slightly depressing, and we would not really have an answer to our problems, and it wouldn't make for a very good Friday night that you've all sacrificed to come and listen to city financing. So we want to end on what we can do, right? And I think it's really important to stress that the power of what we can do lies on us, right? It doesn't lie on anyone else, it lies on us as Africans. So the first thing we need to do, this works? No, there we go. We need to, first of all, have a coherent vision for what we actually want for our cities. This sounds really easy, but many places I work in, the national government will have one vision, the city government will have another vision, and then you go to a second city government and it will have a different vision from the first city government and the national government. That is not a plan. Urbanization is something that affects the country, not just the city of where people are living in. And a place that actually has tried to start doing this well in reason is Kenya. So they reformed their constitution in 2010. And they actually devolved a lot more power to counties within which cities lie. And in this, they're starting to try and create this vision for what Kenyan urbanization should be, not what the 47 counties urbanization should be, right? We need to, if we're going to be government, we should be one government, not 3 city governments and a national government. As I said, our own source revenues are going to take a lot of time to reform. And the primary place to reform this is with property tax, but I'm not going to go into that right now. What I want to stress here is if transfers play such a big role in Africa, we need to find a way to make those transfers something that African cities can borrow against. And this is not unprecedented. Mexico did this. It created a way where the government stabilized the transfer system. It created an independent commission for transfers. It then allowed the borrowers or the investors to say, you have the first right to take what you're owed from the transfers before it goes to the cities, right? So the borrowers felt secure because the first right of repayment before the transfer actually came to the city was given to the investors. And through this, they unlocked 4 billion additional USD of financing for 90 public entities, including very small cities in Mexico. So we need to find a way to stabilize our transfers as well and to be able to leverage those. And actually Nigeria is currently trying something similar, where the government is trying to create a way where the transfers to the state can be, the first part can be ring-fenced for investors so they can borrow against the transfers for the state, whilst we at the same time improve our own source revenue. We then need to amend our legal structures to actually allow cities to borrow. So this is my city. This is Kampala Capital City Authority. We did really, really amazing revenue reforms, property tax reforms. We increased our own source revenue quite substantially between 2010 and 11 to 2016, 17. We got nearly, but you know, for a city of 1.5 million people, $25 million own source revenue is still absolute values, not very much. But what this trajectory was showing is that we were serious about reform. And so in 2015, we got our credit rating, and we were rated fairly well. The big problem was that in Kampala, the law says, yes, city, you can borrow, but only up to 10% of what you earn in own source revenue. So Kampala, even though it was raising its own source revenue, even though that actually led to a pretty good credit rating, could only have ever borrowed $2.5 million. Now, for anyone who's ever worked in investors and markets here, $2.5 million doesn't even cover the administrative cost of literally going to get that money, right? So we need to, you know, for cities that are serious about reform, we need to find ways to actually incentivize that reform. Kampala has never tried to go get a credit rating since, and actually was very, very disheartened by the whole situation, right? So if you are going to be serious about getting cities to try and reform, you need to incentivize them to continue to reform by actually changing your legal structures that make that reform actually pay off for them. We need to not only improve the creditworthiness of cities, I think what's most important, we need to make cities visible to investors. Many investors do not understand African cities because there is no data out there on African cities. Our cities are economic hubs. Our cities are thriving. We only need to go into some of these places and see how people are really making a living in these cities. But there is nothing to show that. And Dakar in Senegal actually went through a credit rating in 2012 as well. They tried to float a bond. The bond didn't work, again, for political reasons. But if you talk to the mayor at the time and you talk to the advisor of the mayor at the time, they will say they will have gone through the whole process again and again, because what that credit rating did to them is it made them clean up their house. So they first got a shadow rating. The shadow rating wasn't great. And then they knew where to reform. They did those reforms. They got an official rating. The official rating was very good. The municipal bond didn't work out. But so many other investors then started investing in Dakar, because then they had actually cleaned up shop, and they had made, their rating was public, so investors felt comfortable that they had cleaned up shop, right? And then they got other investments. So we need to make this visible effort. And getting a rating is useful, even if it's bad, because at least you know where you need to improve. And that's what Dakar's story was. We need to focus on getting these project pipelines. All too often I sit in cities where an investor will come and they'll say, what should we invest in? And then there'll be a quick meeting in the city and they'll be like, hey, this. An investor's not going to believe that. It needs to be a long-term credible thing, because if the investor's going to put their money in. So we need a pipeline of projects. But we also need a pipeline that focuses on the city strategy and not on the financier's strategy. And Cape Town here is actually really interesting, because in Cape Town, if they borrow money, it has to do one of three things. It has to either expand their revenue base, cut costs, or support economic growth. If it's not doing one of those three things, and this is assessed by 3 different departments, if it's not doing one of those 3 things, Cape Town is not allowed to borrow. That is their strategy. That is what they hold themselves to, right? So if you're gonna borrow money, have a coherent strategy, and also have your red lines about where you're going to not borrow money for. And then finally, we need to invest in how to find domestic currency financing. So this is something I've subsequently done more research on, is the role that national development banks can play. A national development bank is an important intermediary which can, because it's a national institution, it can borrow on the international markets, but it can on-lend to cities in local currency. And because it's a national institution, it knows its cities much better. This is a strategy that has been used everywhere. It's how the UK cities were financed, in Germany, in Italy. This is how cities were financed all the way through history, is with the support of national development banks. Our national development banks in Africa, again, I have more writing on this, are highly undercapitalized and don't function very well. But where they do function actually quite well is in many of the many of the Francophone countries. They have what's called a CDC. And what that CDC does, it is the national institution that takes savings, such as pension and social security payments, and that is then on-lent partially to cities. That is an institution that came from France, and France also has a CDC. But there are many other variations of this. So the DBSA, some of you will know, is the very big. It's now a regional development bank, but it started as a national development bank in Africa. But we need something. We need an entity that can intermediate between international capital markets and local capital markets. We really need to shift the view on what Africa is, but in particular what African cities are. African cities is the sources of economic growth, right? I talked about the youth, the 830 million, but beyond the youth, Africa is critical to our whole global energy transition. 70% of cobalt is found on the continent. That's needed for so many people. If we can build some of the green value chains here, we will be critical. And on top of it, we now have the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which is the largest free trade zone in the world outside of the WTO, right? That narrative is not told. The narrative that is told about Africa and African cities is slums, congestion, poverty, this, that, the other. That makes investors who don't have any other data to go by scared. So part of my role, and why Curtis laughs at me for traveling so much and standing on my little soapbox and speaking, is because part of my role and what I try to do is say, there is a massive opportunity here, right? And actually the place that has realized this opportunity the most is China. China is way ahead of the curve. The reason China is investing in African cities is because they are the ones who understand what a well-managed, fast urban transition can unlock. The reason I live in Hong Kong now, I used to live in Uganda up until 1.5 years ago, is because I want to understand why China, from China's perspective, role in investing in African cities. Because I do think they are way ahead of the curve in understanding what the potential is. But we don't, for many reasons, we don't want just China investing. So we need to make other investors clear that this is not a risky bet. This is actually a critically necessary bet, not just for African cities, but globally. The time to think big is now, right? I cannot emphasize doing one of these things is not going to help, right? This is something that needs to be done collectively. It needs to be a coherent strategy and a financing strategy. But again, I emphasize the people who need to lead this vision are us as Africans, right? We need to be the ones who strengthen our systems. We need to be the ones who take the leadership on this, and we need to be the ones who make the changes. And I have worked in cities across the continent. I've worked now this week with incredible people who are leading this charge, and they're the ones who need to be supported to do it. And if we can do it, and I'm convinced we can, because otherwise I wouldn't be sitting here, and I wouldn't be standing here, and I wouldn't be telling you this. That's how we convince investors, it's how we convince financiers, it's how we convince the world that Africa is open for business. And once we convince them that Africa is open for business, that is how our cities will not only be places where citizens can live, but it will be places where citizens can thrive. Asante sana. This is the report. It's freely downloadable on PDF there.